Welcome everybody to the final week in our course on literature and cinema in lockdown. Today we're going to be looking at the novel The Plague, La Peste, by the French writer Albert Camus. The reason I'm finishing with this novel is that it brings up again a lot of the themes we've looked at in relation to the other texts on the course, and indeed touches on a lot of the themes we've been exploring since the start of the course. Camus is considered one of the great French writers of the 20th century, one of the great European writers, in fact, of the 20th century. He was born in 1913, died in 1960. He saw the changes of both the world wars in his lifetime. He was from a very modest background. His father was killed in World War I, so he was brought up by his single mother. So he experienced very obviously the effects of the First World War. And then, as I'll mention in a moment, he participated in the Second World War. He grew up in French Algeria. Algeria was a French territory from 1830 to 1962. And the Camus family were part of a wave of lower middle class French people that moved to the colony to make better lives for themselves. The novel is set in the French Algerian city of Oran in French. Something that has frustrated readers of the novel, especially in recent years, is its limited perspective. The main characters are all white and male, so white French men. Women and Arabs seem to be relegated to the sidelines in it. Camus himself was involved in anti-racist and anti-colonial political activity while he was in Algeria. He wasn't a Marxist himself, but he joined the Communist Party partly because, or largely because, he thought it was a good platform to agitate for equality between Arabs and French in Algeria. That's one part of his political background, which I think is relevant to the novel. Another part, which I think you'll find has echoes with some of the plot of the novel, is that he moved to Paris shortly before the Nazi occupation. So when the Nazis arrived, he tried to flee, or he hoped to flee, but in the end decided to stay in Paris and work with the French resistance. This has obvious echoes with the story of the character of Raymond Rambert in the novel. The novel has often been read as an allegory for the German occupation of France. So not really being about a plague at all, but being about the experience of French people under Nazi occupation. Part of the reason for this is that, of course, Camus himself never lived through a plague. So the plague that we are given in this novel is completely fictional. However, we who have experienced a global pandemic, I think, read this novel very differently from the way the generations that preceded us have. To write the book, Camus immersed himself in the history of pandemics. He looked at the Black Death, that what we saw in the Decameron. He looked at later Italian plagues in the 17th century, the Black Death in England in the 17th century, and at Chinese plagues in the 18th and 19th century. So he did a lot of historical research. But I think part of the genius of the book, which only we who've lived through or are living through a global pandemic can really appreciate, is that the novel has an extraordinarily accurate evocation of what it feels like to live through a pandemic, what it feels like on the individual human level to live through a pandemic. This is something Camus had no experience of, but seems to imagine in an extraordinarily vivid way. In fact, as many recent readers have noticed, the book shows uncanny similarities psychologically with experiences we've had ourselves. So even though this is an account of a fictional plague, one that he had to imagine, because he managed to imagine it so vividly and so accurately, for us who have actually lived through a plague or living through one, it's a way of learning from the experiences we've had. Not exactly to get lessons from them, but I suppose to understand in a deeper way what the psychological experience has meant.